There's no doubt that Lada was the dominant force of the Soviet automotive industry and possibly of the entire Eastern Bloc. It had everything: funding, resources, and a large pool of qualified engineers and designers. The results of that work are well known, and I've already covered many production Lada models in separate videos. But today isn't about cars that made it to the assembly line. Today is about concepts and prototypes, projects that turned out to be failures, strange, misplaced, and sometimes simply unnecessary. And notably, most of them appeared after the collapse of the Soviet system, in the era of the free market. Let's take a closer look at what went wrong. The first Lada prototype on this list is probably the most harmless, and overall, a debatable one. It's difficult to call it truly bad, yet it still deserves to be mentioned. This is the Lada 1151 Gnome, presented in 1990. The problem with this model was not its technical specifications, nor the idea itself. On the contrary, the concept of a compact urban car was quite reasonable. Designed in the bio-design style, the Gnome featured a plastic body mounted on a metal frame. The three-door interior accommodated 2 adult seats and 2 child seats. Power came from a 30-horsepower, 2-cylinder engine borrowed from the Oka. The car was approximately 2.5 meters long, with a turning radius of no more than 3.5 meters. The Gnome was positioned as a car for a young family. Several derivatives were planned on its basis, including a small urban pickup, a leisure cabriolet, and an electric vehicle. The electric version appeared in 1992, followed later by an open, doorless cabriolet variant. To be fair, there is little reason to seriously criticize the Gnome itself or its derivative, the Elf. Its appearance was neutral, and its technical parameters were fully adequate for its class. However, the real significance of the Gnome lies elsewhere. It became the first prototype that marked the beginning of a whole series of experimental projects at the factory, many of which were far more questionable and conceptually weaker. Against that backdrop, the Gnome looks less like a failure and more like a starting point. The Lada 1901, first shown in 1992, was intended as a replacement for the aging Oka. However, instead of an evolutionary development of the existing model, the designers followed the fashionable bio-design trend of the time, with results that were, to put it mildly, unsuccessful. What's more, the project was only presented to the general public in 1998 at the Moscow Auto Show, where it made a highly ambiguous impression. In reality, the Lada 1901 was not a car at all, but a full-scale mock-up. The project had no technical specifications to speak of. There was no interior. The windows were sealed, and neither the doors, nor the hood, nor the trunk could be opened. Despite this, the mock-up was still exhibited at the auto show. Unsurprisingly, the project never progressed any further. Notably, the Lada 1901 also became the first prototype created in the post-Soviet period. In the same year, 1998, another prototype was presented, the Lada Rapan. And perhaps under different economic conditions and in a different historical context, such a project might have looked interesting in its own way. But in this case, context was everything. 1998 was a period of severe economic crisis, hyperinflation, widespread wage arrears, and the collapse of industrial enterprises that had only recently been part of the Soviet economic system. People accustomed to relative stability were rapidly losing both income and social standing. The situation at the Lada plant itself was no better. Having failed in the relatively prosperous 1980s to develop and launch a proper replacement for its classic rear-wheel drive models rooted in the Fiat 124, the Togliatti factory entered the 1990s still producing those same cars. Not by modernizing them, but by simplifying designs and cutting costs. The situation was further aggravated by a criminal struggle surrounding the enterprise, a topic I've already touched on in the video about the Samara. Export markets were shrinking rapidly. While Lada cars had once found buyers in Europe despite their rough assembly, by the late 1990s, declining quality meant demand was falling even on the domestic market. And so, in conditions of poverty, production stagnation, and the loss of foreign markets, the factory chose not to concentrate its remaining financial and technical resources on developing a new mass-market car to replace the morally and physically outdated descendants of the Fiat 124. Instead, Lada presented the Rapan concept at the Paris Motor Show. Unlike the previous prototype, the Rapan was no longer just a mock-up. It had an interior, opening doors, and could move under its own power. More than that, it featured an electric drivetrain rated at 25 kilowatts, with a claimed range of around 110 kilometers. Yes, the unusual prototype did attract some attention. A number of European automotive magazines even published standalone articles about it. But that was as far as the story went. The Lada Rapan became a revealing illustration of how a factory in deep crisis set its priorities. At a time when the market was waiting for simple, affordable, and realistic solutions, the presentation of such a concept looked out of place. There was a complete absence of market logic, and no real prospect of series production. The technical base was weak, especially for mastering what was, at the time, a still immature electric vehicle technology. Perhaps today the Rapan might look intriguing, but back then, in that situation, it came across as alien and off-putting. If we set aside Lada's rather baffling detours into attempts at building a golf cart, which already sounded absurd in late 1990s Russia, the next unsuccessful prototype worth discussing is Lada Project C, first shown in 2004. Project C was an attempt by Lada, together with the Canadian company Magna International, to create a modern platform and an entire family of C-segment cars, a compact mainstream class. The plans included a sedan, a hatchback, a station wagon, and even a crossover, all intended to offer a higher level of quality, design, and technical sophistication than traditional Lada models. The idea itself looked reasonable, even commendable. However, from the very beginning, the project raised many questions. First of all, journalists and car enthusiasts were concerned by the complete lack of concrete information. No engines were announced, no technical specifications were disclosed, and the overall impression increasingly suggested yet another concept being displayed at auto shows without any real prospects of series production. The company's management dismissed these concerns. Public statements insisted that launching the car into production was merely a matter of time, that most of the work had already been done and only minor details remained before the start of mass production. Despite these assurances, the project continued to face serious doubts. These included questions about interior ergonomics, material quality, and most importantly, the car's ability to compete with Western counterparts, which was, in fact, the core objective of Project C. Some automotive enthusiasts also believed that even if the car had reached production, it would likely have been too expensive for its target buyers, while still falling short technologically compared to competitors in the same segment. Judging by the few examples that were actually built, concerns about build quality do not appear unfounded. Project C continued to be shown at exhibitions until 2009, with repeated promises that production was about to begin. However, the project was ultimately frozen in 2009 following the arrival of the Renault-Nissan alliance and a shift to a different platform, which later became the basis for the Lada Vesta. For that reason, it is difficult to describe Project C as a successful concept, even with considerable goodwill. And next comes the 2008 concept known as the Lada Kalina 4x4 concept. And here, just like in the case of the Rapan, context once again matters. By this point, the crisis-ridden 1990s were already over, and the factory was in a relatively stable, and in some years even profitable, position. However, over that entire period, Lada had failed to bring a single, fundamentally new car to market. The gap between Lada and Western manufacturers continued to widen. Export ambitions had been completely abandoned, and while the brand's cars still sold domestically, they did not enjoy genuine public affection. At the same time, the production lines still included the Samara and the Niva. By then, the Niva seemed to have stayed in production for far too long, and many were expecting a new generation to finally appear. At the time, few realized that the Niva was destined to become a true long runner and would remain on the assembly line for decades to come. In essence, the situation was not all that different from 10 years earlier, without the acute crisis, but with the same expectations. The public was waiting for simple, affordable, and above all, realistic new cars. Instead, the factory once again presented a concept with no real connection to series production and not even a theoretical chance of becoming a production model. Design can be set aside as a matter of taste, although in my view, it is difficult to call it successful. More important is the fact that the Kalina 4x4 concept, like many similar projects, was not accompanied by any meaningful technical details, and most likely did not even have a complete technical foundation. Once again, a clearly unviable mock-up was taken from one auto show to another, at a time when, even on its home market, Lada was already facing growing pressure from inexpensive and reliable Korean cars, not to mention competition abroad. To be fair, this mock-up was created as part of a student design competition initiated by the company's management, and was not a direct product of Lada's engineering department. Even so, the appearance of such a concept once again highlighted the priorities that were shaping the direction of the Togliatti carmaker at the time. Finally, it's worth recalling one more unsuccessful attempt to create a replacement for the Oka, which by that point had already left the production line. The basis for this project was the mass-produced Kalina, with its body and chassis shortened. The result looked, to put it mildly, comical. The developers claimed that if the car ever reached series production, it would receive a new front end and that the overall design would become more balanced. However, the project never made it to production. Even though the required investment was minimal, the car was roughly 80% unified with the standard Kalina, yet the new Oka project ultimately remained in this experimental and, frankly, awkward form. With that, the list of unsuccessful Lada prototypes can be considered complete. In reality, there were not that many of them. In fact, the factory produced even more promising and genuinely interesting prototypes. Unfortunately, many of those never became production cars. If this video resonates with you, I will definitely make a follow-up, this time focusing on the Lada prototypes that truly deserved a place on the assembly line. And with that, we're done. Share your thoughts in the comments, and see you next time.